There's a moment in GoodFellas that almost every viewer remembers long after credits roll. A single unbroken camera movement to the back entrance of the Copacabana nightclub that weaves through kitchens and corridors before arriving at a front row table, all without a single visible cut. That shot runs for roughly 3 minutes, and it changed what crime cinema could feel like. But what most people never learned is how close it came to never existing at all. GoodFellas is one of those rare films that the more you understand how it was made, the more astonishing it becomes. Not just a cinema, but as a document of obsession, accident, grief, and relentless human will. Beneath its effortless surface lies a production built on secrets, and those secrets are exactly what gave this film its soul. The Copacabana tracking shot required the actual club to be physically altered so that the Steadicam operator could navigate corridors barely wide enough for the equipment. Every waiter, cook, and background performer had to hit precise marks at exact moments, while Ray Liotta and Lorraine Bracco moved through the space with a kind of casual charm that hides extraordinary choreographic precision. It took 8 attempts before everything finally aligned, and the reason it kept failing had almost nothing to do with cameras or lighting or the dozens of extras required to make the sequence work. It came down to a single comedian delivering a single punchline. Henny Youngman was performing on stage at the moment the camera arrived in the nightclub, and he kept missing his cue. Every failed delivery sent the entire production back to the beginning, resetting the Steadicam operator, the extras carrying tables, the kitchen staff, and the principal actors. When that punchline finally landed on the 8th take, the relief on set was enormous, but the experience had already revealed something essential about filmmaking at this level. Perfection at this scale depends on every single element arriving at exactly the right moment, and the weakest link is almost never where you expect it to be. What most audiences have never fully appreciated is that the spontaneity they feel throughout GoodFellas is itself a carefully constructed illusion. The screenplay went through approximately 12 full drafts, with Scorsese and co-writer Nicholas Pileggi refining every scene with a precision that borders on obsessive. Extensive storyboards mapped visual compositions across the entire film. Detailed rehearsals allowed actors to internalize rhythms and relationships until they felt completely natural. The structure was entirely solid before a single frame was shot. What the director then introduced was something more specific and more interesting than pure improvisation. He allowed controlled freedom within boundaries that had already been tested and refined over months. Actors knew exactly where each scene needed to go, which gave them the confidence to play within those boundaries without worrying about where the scene was heading. The result sounds like real conversation because it was built on the architecture of real dramatic necessity. The chaos everyone admires is actually one of the most disciplined elements in the entire production, designed from the ground up to feel like it had no design at all. The competitive energy that shaped the film is rarely discussed, but it was present from the beginning. Scorsese had been watching other filmmakers push the boundaries of cinematic technique, absorbing extended takes and fluid camera experiments from the landscape around him, and that observation ignited something that went beyond mere admiration. It became a quiet and productive rivalry of the kind that exists among artists who respect each other deeply but refuse to be outdone. The Copacabana sequence did not emerge simply from creative inspiration. It was partly a response to what Scorsese had seen others accomplish, a determination to take what he had observed and push it significantly further. That competitive fuel elevated every visual decision in the film, adding an extra layer of intention to choices that might otherwise have settled for competence. Great art does not always emerge from solitary inspiration, sitting quietly in a room. Sometimes it is born from watching someone else do something remarkable and feeling the absolute need to go further. During production, Ray Liotta was carrying a profound personal grief following a family tragedy, an emotional weight that would have sidelined many actors and caused most directors to adjust their schedules out of basic compassion. Scorsese made a different kind of calculation. He recognized something in Liotta's pain that could serve the story, a rawness of emotion that was already present and did not need to be manufactured through technique. Rather than working around what Liotta was experiencing, the director channeled it directly into a scene requiring explosive aggression, the moment where Henry violently confronts his neighbor. The result is a performance that feels genuinely unhinged in a way that goes beyond acting skill. There is a quality in that scene that audiences sense instinctively without being able to name it, a pain that is too specific and too real to have come purely from preparation. It stands as a testament to Scorsese's understanding of human emotion, his knowledge of when to push, when to protect, and when to let real feeling bleed directly into fiction rather than asking actors to simulate something they are already living through. The soundtrack that runs through GoodFellas represented an investment that alarmed studio executives during production, approaching a reported $1 million in music licensing at a time when such figures were virtually unheard of for a film score. Scorsese refused substitutes. He refused sound-alikes. If a scene needed a specific recording from 1963, that exact recording had to be there. The director understood music not as atmosphere but as narrative, treating each song as a tool that could mark a shift in time, in mood, or in the psychological state of a character. Songs in this film do not simply accompany the story. They comment on it, sometimes with irony, sometimes with devastating emotional accuracy, always with precision that required absolute insistence on the right track in the right moment regardless of what it cost. The result functions as a second screenplay written entirely in rhythm, melody, and cultural memory, one that continues working on audiences long after the dialogue has faded from their conscious recall. The production did not merely depict organized crime. It accidentally employed it. Several of the background performers who were cast as extras turned out to have genuine connections to the criminal underworld, a discovery that became apparent almost immediately when the payroll department began processing payments and encountered individuals providing fake names, incomplete paperwork, or no valid identification whatsoever. Standard industry procedures clashed uncomfortably with people who had spent their entire lives deliberately avoiding official documentation. The accounting team found themselves navigating a situation that felt uncomfortably close to the world being dramatized on screen. What makes this detail so fitting in retrospect is how perfectly it mirrors the film's central concerns. A production about men who operated outside legal systems was being quietly infiltrated by men who did exactly the same in real life, and the line between fiction and documentary blurred in ways that nobody had anticipated and nobody was entirely sure how to manage. Those extras with genuine criminal connections did not stop at simply accepting the work. A group of background performers with alleged real-world ties began making financial demands that went well beyond standard pay rates, and when those demands were not immediately met, the situation escalated into something the production team had not remotely prepared for. Veiled threats replaced polite negotiation. Aggressive confrontations disrupted the rhythms of ordinary set management. The crew found itself dealing not with actors playing intimidating characters, but with people who had no need to act a part and no intention of following conventional industry protocols. The irony was impossible to escape. A film about men who use intimidation as a professional tool was being disrupted by men using those exact same tactics in real life, just off camera, in the unglamorous margins of daily production, where the mythology of cinema gives way to something considerably less comfortable. One of the most electrifying scenes in GoodFellas came not from the screenplay, but from a real moment that Joe Pesci had lived years before anyone conceived of the film. While working at a restaurant, Pesci had complimented a wise guy and received a deeply unsettling, unpredictable response that stayed with him for years. When he shared the story with Scorsese, the director recognized its potential immediately. Rather than scripting the famous funny how exchanged word for word, they developed a loose framework that gave Pesci room to work while deliberately keeping Ray Liotta uncertain about where the confrontation was heading. The confusion and visible nervousness Liotta displays are partially genuine, which give the scene its deeply unsettling edge. The other actors at the table were not entirely certain where Pesci was taking things either, and that collective uncertainty translates directly to the screen. Audiences have always sensed that something underneath the performance is lived in and real, because it is. The scene has been quoted and studied for decades, and its enduring power comes from the simple fact that it once actually happened to someone sitting at a real table in a real room. The film came within a narrow margin of being buried by the ratings board before general audiences ever saw it. When the finished cut was submitted to the MPAA, the level of on-screen brutality triggered serious concerns that threatened to produce a restrictive rating capable of severely limiting the film's theatrical release and commercial potential. Scorsese and editor Thelma Schoonmaker entered negotiations that required extraordinary precision. Rather than removing entire sequences, they made surgical adjustments of just a few frames, trimming the duration of certain moments by amounts so minimal that virtually no viewer would ever notice the difference. Those tiny concessions were just enough to satisfy the board's requirements without compromising the film's visceral impact, leaving the final version feeling every bit as relentless and intense as the original cut. Scorsese understood that the perception of violence often hits harder than explicit imagery, and the film's editing already relied heavily on implication and the imagination of the audience. A masterclass in knowing precisely how far boundaries can be pushed before something pushes back. The dinner scene at Tommy's mother's house is widely considered one of the most authentic moments in crime cinema, and its authenticity has a very specific origin. The woman sitting across the table from Pesci and Liotta, preparing food and discussing a painting she has on the wall, was Catherine Scorsese, the director's real mother and not a professional actress by any measure. She improvised much of her dialogue, drawing naturally from decades of preparing meals for large Italian-American family gatherings. Even the painting that Tommy remarks upon was her own work, brought from home specifically for the scene. By placing trained professional actors alongside someone who was not performing at all, Scorsese created a contrast that makes the scene feel startlingly intimate. It is a quiet moment sandwiched between extreme brutality, and the warmth registers as genuine because it is genuine, a quality that no amount of rehearsal could have manufactured from scratch. After the film's release, reports surfaced from organized crime circles that real figures in that world found portrayal remarkably accurate. What resonated most with those insiders was not the violence or the glamour that disturbed mainstream audiences, but the everyday texture of the world on screen, the hierarchy of respect, the unwritten rules, the way men spoke to each other across dinner tables and in back rooms. For people who had lived that life, the film captured their daily reality with an accuracy that felt almost uncomfortably close. That duality, criminal approval existing alongside mainstream shock, is part of what gives GoodFellas its lasting complexity. It does not ask viewers to sympathize or condemn. It presents a world with enough authenticity that the people who built it nodded quietly, while everyone else sat in stunned disbelief trying to process what they had just witnessed. Paul Sorvino nearly walked away from the role of Paulie before shooting a single scene. The psychological demands of portraying a man capable of cold, calculated cruelty were almost too much for an actor defined by warmth and classical sensitivity. A performer so removed his own personality from the character's quiet menace that the disconnect felt at times like a fundamental betrayal of himself. What ultimately appeared on screen is a performance of extraordinary restraint. Paulie rarely raises his voice, rarely moves aggressively. His authority lives in pauses and glances, in the weight of what goes unspoken. That effortless quality required enormous emotional labor from someone who had to suppress everything natural about himself to locate the character. The fact that he nearly did not take the role makes every silent, commanding moment more remarkable in hindsight. Much of the profanity that shocked audiences and critics was not written into the original screenplay. It emerged organically through controlled improvisation Scorsese actively encouraged throughout production. When actors were given freedom to play within structured scenes, their instinct was to lean into the raw, unfiltered language that their characters would naturally use, interrupting themselves, repeating thoughts, punctuating nearly every sentence in ways that no polished script would have captured. The word count for strong language reportedly ranks among the highest in mainstream cinema history, a figure that surprised even the filmmakers when they reviewed assembled footage. What matters is that none of it feels deliberate or designed to shock. It feels like an intercepted conversation, because the actors were trusted to inhabit their roles completely enough that the words simply took care of themselves. The money handled in several key scenes was genuine currency. Real bills in quantities large enough to make any set supervisor nervous. The decision was made not for spectacle but for texture, based on Scorsese's belief that actors handle real money differently than props, that there's a weight and a tactile reality to actual cash that changes how fingers move and how eyes respond in ways the camera can detect even when audiences cannot consciously articulate why a scene feels different. Prop money, however well made, lacks that unconscious psychological shift. Security had to be considerably heightened, and tracking every bill between takes became an additional burden on an already complex production. But for a director determined to eliminate anything that felt false, the complication was always worth the result. Before the final ensemble came together, the production had seriously considered casting directions that would have produced a fundamentally different film. High-profile actors circulated in early discussions whose screen presence would have pulled the chemistry of the central relationships in incompatible directions. What makes the final product so dependent on its specific cast is how precisely the dynamic between Liotta, Pesci, and De Niro create a triangle of charm, volatility, and quiet authority that defines every scene they share. Replacing any element in that equation would have recalibrated everything: the humor, the menace, the shifting power dynamics that keep each interaction feeling genuinely unpredictable. The casting that almost happened is a reminder that great films are not simply about assembling great actors. They are about the right actors finding each other at exactly the right moment. Al Pacino was approached for a key role and declined. Had he accepted, the gravitational pull of his presence would have altered every dynamic around him in ways that might have overwhelmed the ensemble balance the film required. His absence opened the door for choices that prioritized chemistry over individual star power, creating a cast whose energies complemented rather than competed with each other. It is one of cinema's more compelling examples of how a film can be defined as much by who is not in it as by who is. Ray Liotta earned his role not through a conventional audition, but through a campaign of persistence that mirrored the character he was trying to play. He made repeated calls, sought meetings through every available channel, and made his interests impossible to ignore at a time when Scorsese was seriously considering established actors for part. The parallel between actor and character is almost too precise. Henry Hill spent his life inserting himself into rooms where he was not initially welcome, using charm and sheer determination to create opportunities that were not offered to him. Liotta did exactly the same thing to win a role, and Scorsese eventually recognized that the man pursuing the part was already embodied in every interaction. What ended up on screen represents only a fraction of the real story. Henry Hill's actual criminal career included episodes so extreme that incorporating them would have pushed the film into territory that risked overwhelming the audience entirely. Several major real-life incidents were excluded not because they lacked dramatic potential, but because they would have disrupted the film's pacing and emotional architecture, events too complex to dramatize without lengthy exposition. Others so dark that their inclusion would have shifted the tone from compelling to genuinely unbearable. The decision to withhold the most extreme material reveals something essential about Scorsese's storytelling instincts. A film that shows everything risks becoming an endurance test. By selecting which truths to tell and which to deliberately leave in shadow, he created something that feels complete while leaving enormous darkness just beyond the frame. The real Henry Hill's life contained chapters that even this unflinching film cannot accommodate, and that thought alone is enough to make you reconsider everything you believe you understood about how deep this story actually goes. Every frame of GoodFellas was shaped by discipline disguised as chaos and control disguised as freedom. The tracking shot, the real cash, the genuine grief, the lived experience of a real confrontation, the real mobsters on the payroll, the mother's painting brought from home, all of it points toward a production where the line between reality and fiction was never entirely fixed. More than 3 decades later, the film endures because it was built on a foundation of obsessive authenticity that audiences feel even when they cannot fully explain it. The performances, the music, the editing, the happy accidents, and the deliberate omissions all serve a singular vision, one that continues to set the standard for crime cinema and shows absolutely no sign of loosening its grip on anyone who encounters it for the first time or returns to it for 20th.